Welcome to the Waggle Room. When honeybees return to the hive, they perform a waggle dance, not to give answers, but to share signals, direction, distance, quality and possibility. Many dances can happen at once, different options, different signals, all moving through the colony together. Over time, patterns form, attention shifts, some signals fade, others gather momentum, and a way forward begins to emerge. Humans do this too, in groups, communities, in moments of uncertainty, long before anything feels clear or settled. The Waggle Room is a space to notice those signals, explore the systems they sit within, and make sense of what's emerging. Signals, systems, sense-making.
Right, welcome to the Waggle Room, everyone. Over the moon today, I got Steve Hearsum on the podcast. I'll let Steve introduce himself in a minute, but obviously, as usual on the Waggle Room, it's all about signals, systems, and sense making. So we're trying to not necessarily get any concrete answers, no best practice, but we're trying to find the signals that people are noticing and sometimes struggle to even name or bring up in conversations. So I came across Steve through a webinar, I think it was. He was on a webinar with a guy called Paul Sweeney, who was on an earlier podcast. That led me on to get Steve's book, which I've read, which is absolutely fantastic. And I'll put a link to that in the podcast. And the thing that after reading Steve's book, it's I felt like I wasn't screaming in the mirror by myself, I suppose is the best way I can explain it. It's fantastic reading it. It just makes you wonder why lots of other people don't see the world the way Steve sees it, is probably the best way I can say it. So that's been sitting me for quite a long time. So I reached out to Steve and asked him to come onto the podcast, and which he's done. Steve, welcome to the Waggle Room. I don't know if you want to just give us a bit of an overview of yourself and how you got to where you are now.
Well, in terms of who I am, what I do, I'm the roles I play are consultant, executive coach, supervisor, and I specialize in consultants and change practitioners, occasional speaker and author. What I actually do when people ask me that, my short kind of slightly flip answer is I help people have the conversations they're avoiding having with themselves and or each other, because most of the work I do, when I think about what happens in organizations or teams, at some point runs up against the fact that people are struggling to be candid with each other. They're struggling to be honest. They're struggling to have constructive conflict. And sometimes they're also not having the conversations they need to with themselves, which is why I talk a lot about reflexive practice. So most of my work these days revolves around practice. So what I mean by that is the practices that leaders need to develop that helps them understand how they show up and the impact they have, or the practices and the practice that a consultant or change agent has when they're doing their work. And also in the context of culture work and changing organizations, what are the practices that people need to learn if they're actually going to change things beyond tools and methodologies, which are all wonderful, but are utterly meaningless and pointless unless you can ally them to practices.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot in there, which I think we'll come back to as a podcast goes on, because the word practice is, really important. I think you can tell people this as much as you want, like a PowerPoint presentation or sit them in a classroom. If you don't give anybody the actual means to put these things into practice, especially now you see it's, you go on these courses, it almost becomes like a badge. It's like little Boy Scouts almost. It becomes like a badge collecting exercise, and you could end up with lots of badges, but not actually, make the fire, which I find a very weird thing going on.
Well, what I immediately went to there was actually, if we go back to the Boy Scouts or the Girl Guides, I mean, the great thing is that actually, and the Woodcraft folk, if you live in Brighton like I do, and you want to be a bit more hippie, then of course they are doing both, because you get your badge because you're out in the woods whittling or trying to make fire with sticks. You are learning a practice in order to make fire or whatever it is you're doing, and you get your badge as a result. The difference is, if you go into a basement of a hotel and get a pro-sci qualification or some other badge, that is not in the woods. That is not in your organization. It is in a sterile environment, disconnected from the messy reality of your work. So, if you look at a dictionary definition of practice, the key thing is the actual application or use of an idea, belief, or method, as opposed to, and this is the kicker, theories relating to it.
Yeah, 100%. And we'll come on to the book probably in more detail, but it's a good place to start. I mean, all that time you spent in organizations, was there a moment where you thought, I've got to start getting this down on paper? Or
Well,
did it just happen over a period of time?
I think that I've reflected on this a lot. I mean, the story I tell in the book is you could argue is a kind of a moment where the thing kind of came into being, which was the Corporate Rebels, founded by Pim and Hust in Holland. I met them at a holacracy workshop in Brighton in, I think it must have been 2014, 2015. And we then invited them to Roffey a couple of times. I hosted them both times. The second time they came, one of them at one point said to the audience of very experienced coaches and consultants, we thought 2 years ago that at the end of our traipsing around the planet, we'd come up with a magic bullet, but we've realized there isn't one. And that wasn't surprise. The surprise was that the audience, not to a man or woman, but the kind of group, the entity of the group, several times then kind of went, but go on, there is one, isn't there? And that's what hooked me. And I checked it with the Dutch guys whilst I was there. I said, did you notice that? This was during the lunch break, I think, or a coffee break. And I said, yeah, we clocked that as well. So it wasn't just my meaning making. There was something in the room that was live there. And then that then kind of sparked this kind of moment of, well, wait a minute. If really experienced people who've just been told by people who've been looking for a magic bullet that there is no magic bullet, how come we're all looking for them? And then I started to think about what I did working for a globally renowned institute, and then think about what my clients would ask for and how we would be asked to present our offers. And you start to clock what they're looking for. You start to clock what they're looking for is a kind of certainty. You can't sell them ambiguity. You've got to sell them certainty.
Selling someone ambiguity is that's an interesting point. Who's going to pay for ambiguity?
There's this thing about, are you selling somebody the answer, or are you selling them a approach to sense making, meaning making, and problem solving?
Yes. And
I would argue that the honest answer, unless, for example, you're doing something like selling cloud server technology, right? Well, actually, I'm going to backtrack here because I know people who work in that space, right? And I had a long conversation with an old friend of mine who spent several years at Amazon Web Services. And I remember him vividly saying to me, Steve, the interesting thing is the technology is not the issue, right? Yep. We can do cloud computing. We can drop it in wherever you bloody want. The issue is the power, the politics, the decision-making, the processes that need to change within the client system as the technology is implemented. So are you selling cloud computing or cloud services, or are you selling an approach that might help the client make sense of how they need to adapt, how they work with the new technology and their relationships to and with each other? But that's not what's sold, but that's what's needed.
We're all colluding in this, aren't we? It's a weird thing. I know that you know that I know what I'm saying isn't really going to be the thing you want, but it's like we're in some sort of seance or something, and everyone knows it's pretend, but nobody really wants to be the person that puts their hand up and say, no, I'm not touching anything, like nothing's moving.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the collusive bit, that comes from Graham Curtis, who wrote a wonderful PhD where he coined this phrase, functional collusion, and this idea that there are decision-making processes that are unconsciously influenced and informed by patterns of shame and anxiety. And that was the thing that unlocked the book, which was, hang on a minute, how is it that people are buying and selling silver bullets? What is it that is leading to this very functional, highly profitable collusion? I wonder whether it's to do with the unconscious anxiety and shame and need for certainty. And that's what then unfolded.
Yeah, those words, shame and anxiety, I don't really think I've seen them in this sort of genre, if you like, but you put them front and center around when you're trying to say, look, this is uncomfortable for people.
Well, it's a really interesting observation, which is that they're not put front and center, which is there's two responses to that, two main responses. Well, one, are they relevant? So therefore they shouldn't be put front and center. Well, I would argue that they are highly relevant, and we can debate that. Or two, if they are relevant, then how come they're not talked about? Well, the obvious one with shame is Elliot Ram, who's the CEO of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, a very good paper she wrote. She talks about the paradoxical nature of shame, that on the one hand, it demands to be hidden because it's shame. On the other hand, all the learning comes from bringing it out in the open.
Yeah.
Right? The anxiety piece, well, I'll pull one thread dangling from this exchange, which is still the dominant mode of leadership discourse is heroic leadership.
Yeah.
And what model of heroic leader is one that talks about anxiety? We don't have any other exemplars of that. Not in kind of the the archetypes or the models we have of leaders. They're not there.
I read a few years ago now David Graeber's book on bullshit jobs. Again, only when I started reading and you were talking about shame and anxiety, he talks about almost in part of that book, it's about some people know that really the job is, call it whatever you want. He calls it a bullshit job. So people obviously don't want to put their hands up and say that. So this really resonated with me reading back to that book as well. I thought, oh yeah, there's a thread in there somewhere.
Well, there's another bit which increasingly I think if I was to rewrite the book again, I think I would have foregrounded another thread and then tied the shame and anxiety, which is power. Paul Sweeney talked very articulately and beautifully about power in organisations. I think it's one of the strongest sections of his book, actually. But there's a really interesting lens for power that I stumbled across recently through working with a chap called Andrew Grenfell, where he talks about complicity and how we become complicit in our relationship with power within organisations. And he talks about how we give up certain things in return for giving up.
Yeah.
And one of the ways I kind of interpret that through the lens of practice, if you think about particularly internal practitioners, there's a question that I always ask internal practitioners when I work with them, there's two questions actually, there's two questions you need to ask yourself. One is, how do I progress in this organisation? The other one is, how do I be of most service? And at some point, those two will be in opposition. It's different for you and me, Mick. We're externals, right?
Yeah.
You and I off a client, then we'll have other clients, as long as we don't do it all the time. But an internal is up close and personal to power, and they have to make a really clear choice. And I don't judge either way whether somebody says they choose to protect their position as opposed to be of service, because they may have a family to feed, or so on and so forth. But let's be really honest about what the ask is here. To progress an organisation and to be of most service will, I would say, not on not just occasions, but quite frequently be in direct opposition to each other. And that is not actually talked about that much.
No. Yeah, I do come across that. Especially, I mean, I know people talk about flat organisations, but I'd say most organisations have some sort of hierarchy in different ways, shapes or forms. I used to be in the military. Military's got a very structured, hierarchy for lots of different reasons. I've definitely been in my position, that position myself, if someone of a different rank and you don't want to upset the apple cart. So I can totally understand why, do you know what, if somebody's saying, we're going to use this methodology and we're going to do it like that, and that's just the way it's going to be. What do? Do you sort of die on a hill about that, or do you try and work within that system to try and get something done?
Well, there's all the wonderful stuff about temper radicals, which you dig under the skin of the Myerson stuff. It's really interesting because you are talking about complicity and whether somebody is willing to comply with what is being asked of them. What Andrew Grenfell talks about, there's a couple of bits that I think are really, really sweet. He talks about there's a kind of unconscious complicity contract, which is, and I'll just give you a flavour of it, that we give up responsibility in order to receive just a sense of going along with. We give up our freedom in return for comfort and safety. And this is my favourite, the third one. We give up the right to consent in return for the right to complain without actually a demand for change. Right? You're not demanding change. It's just a right to complain. And then you get to, you're giving up your power and your choice in return for innocence. I'm just following your orders. And the complicity bit, I don't think gets talked about that much.
The complaining bit is interesting as well for me, because I've been in situations like this where you're going in. So can you come and help us do this change? And everyone's complaining about what's going on. Oh God, a very simple example. I come in, can't get a car parking space. Oh God, the computer doesn't turn on quick enough. Oh blimmin' heck, I can't. You then try and put something in place, and then it upsets that system. And the thing that somebody's been complaining about actually turns into the thing that they valued, almost like, I come in, but the computer doesn't come on. Oh, that actually gave me 15 minutes to go and have a cup of tea with Steve. Now, all this has changed. My computer comes on straight away. Oh, I'm not happy with that. And the way complaint happens in the system can almost move, even when somebody wants, they think they're wanting something. When it happens, it's like, no, I don't want that anymore.
Yeah. I mean, you talked about, we're in the Waggle room. I mean, there's the unconscious waggling. There's the patterning and it's not a formal social process. It's the informal stuff.
Yeah. Why, all the silver bullets that we get presented. And this is, it's not like this has been going on for the last sort of 3 or 4 years. This has been going on for a long, long time, all these different silver bullets. And so people have been in these situations many, many times before. And, the majority of people are intelligent, experienced. They want to come to work to make a difference. Why are they so appealing to sort of reach for, do you think?
Well, in simple terms, if we just get a little bit existential for a moment, is because it's too utterly terrifying to contemplate the alternative. Because if you actually admit that you don't have the control that you wish you did, if you actually admit that you don't know what to do, then you have your own internal narrative, your own ego ideal potentially challenged, or maybe the organization ideal, what everybody imagines what you are as this wonderful leader. So to actually admit that you don't know what to do, that you may not know what the answer is, that there may not even be an easy answer, is to leave yourself open not only to your own insecurities, but potentially to be on the end of everybody else's anxiety, as you can't rescue them, however futile and absurd that rescuing may be. I'm doing a presentation next week, a talk around the illusion of control. And the example I'm using of absurdity for the illusion of control is a image that was created by the Conservative Party. Forget your politics for a moment, but it was created by the Conservative Party at the height of the Brexit shenanigans, when Boris Johnson was promising an oven-ready Brexit.
Yeah.
Right? Now, it's actually, they produced an image of an oven-ready Brexit. This was the object. That to me is the most wonderful and exquisite example of attempting to reduce and minimize anxiety and deny it. It is a silver bullet. It's the oven-ready Brexit. Everything will be fine. That's how absurd we get this stuff. But I'd argue that something like ProSci can be that as well. It can in some organizations, not in all organizations, the choice, and depending on how you implement it, of a particular methodology. The stories I've heard around ProSci or Agile, they're just like Boris's oven-ready Brexit. They're just as absurd and futile, depending on how they're implemented.
I always take, the approach that you think you're just going to take whatever methodology, run with it and expect it to work. They can't all be the one truth in any situation, yet people pay lots of bloody money for these one truths that seem to work.
There's so much to be said there. I've got more compassionate since I've written the book.
Yeah.
I was probably more frustrated and angry when I started. If it's because I'm getting close to 60, I don't know. But I'm less grumpy about it, because I actually really feel for lots of these people who work in these large firms. Because, when you consider that they explicitly set out to recruit insecure overachievers, that's part of their modus operandi, to recruit fungible consultants, junior consultants. When you consider that for them to actually admit that maybe their models can't actually follow through on the certainty that they're selling, would be to go against decades of marketing, of everything they promise in their thought leadership. And the single biggest elephant in the room is actually possibly not the models in and of themselves. It's an utter unwillingness to have a conversation about ethics. You will not hear, I've not come across it yet, a really robust and rigorous and honest conversation from the consulting industry about the ethics of the consulting model and how they contract to do large contracts with, say, the public sector.
I've got lots of friends that work in the big consultancies. They're absolutely fantastic.
Absolutely.
This is like the oxymoron about the situation, because
brilliant. Absolutely brilliant practitioners.
Yeah. And it's like this tension, the pressure some of these people must be under must be quite, it's got to be quite enormous, really.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was talking to an old university friend of mine who worked for a leadership company that was bought by one of the big global services firms. And he's kind of stuck in there a bit like golden handcuffs. I had a beer with him a while ago. And he can see it all for what it is, and they've got their room full of people. He described it himself. They are churning out PowerPoints, just regurgitating what they've done elsewhere, and then sticking another 6 or 7 figure sum on the same PowerPoint deck and selling it to somebody else. That's what some of the work is.
Yeah,
and that to me is the literal definition of absurdity. Before you get anywhere near the ethical question,
I had a conversation about this literally last week or the week before. Somebody asked me, okay, imagine you're going to bring, we're going to get some change people involved in something. The question they asked me was, what course would you send them on? And my reply was, I wouldn't send them on a change course. I actually want people that have got critical thinking skills, can solve problems, yet go into situations where they can hold their own, have difficult dialogue with people, but do it in a way where you don't, piss people off. I said I'd rather have someone with those things before I had anyone that just had a change qualification. But that seems to be a bit lost in things now. Those skills are just so important, but they're not really. I don't know. They're not really talked about.
But that to me goes to the heart of this question about what's the difference between a kind of kite mark. Are you doing learning for the kite mark? Are you doing it to validate your practice?
Yeah.
And sometimes it's interesting when I talk to people, I get people approaching me saying, because they see my background, they see I've worked at one institute, I'm involved in the Tavistock. So they come to me and they talk to me about, well, what do you think would be a good place for me to go and study? And I often find myself asking, what's more important to you? Is it the certificate, you get the master's or a postgrad or whatever, or is it what you're going to learn? Is it about your practice? And sometimes you can have both, but actually in not that many cases.
Yeah.
I would argue that there are very few places you can go where you can do really robust and rigorous learning about your practice, but they'll also get you a master's level program or accreditation.
I think that I'm the first person to hold my hand up and say the military have got there's problems, in the military. There's problems with every organisation. It's just the way it is. But I've got a friend called Hugh, and I remember him explaining it to me once. It's almost like in the military, you're just living and breathing, like, about leadership. You were just doing it. It was around you all the time. And yes, they got to a point where they were giving people level 7 in leadership and all this stuff, right? Which is fine. I did 24 years. No one handed me a certificate to say I had a certificate in leadership. But what you probably had was like the equivalent of like a bloody MBA in leadership or something. But I didn't need anyone to tell me. I didn't need anyone to validate that for me from a certification point, because I had enough real world experience to show you where I had done leadership.
I mean, I've not been in the military, Mick, but I've spoken to enough current or ex-military people where I've heard a very similar story from a number of them, which is the classic conversation was somebody who was in the military for over 20 years, who now does team coaching and one-to-one coaching. And I think he was working with some people at Sandhurst a few years ago, and they said to him, during a conflict situation, we are brilliant. We are high performing, we function well, collaborate, we do conflict well, but in peacetime we're as dysfunctional and useless as any organisation. And I did some pro bono coaching in the middle of COVID with frontline medical staff, and I heard a very similar thing, which is what they would say to me, all the petty stuff is gone. I mean, if you work with the NHS, you know this. I mean, it's really hardcore. It's full of politics, big P, small p. But during COVID, much of it went because people had to get shit done.
Yeah.
And so there's a really interesting thing about, what happens when. So I talk in my work about compression. How do you create sufficient compression for something to shift? And horrible to say, but conflict creates compression, and certain change contexts in organizations create compression. I want to kind of immediately say the whole burning platform thing is perverse, and I detest it with a passion. It's not the same thing as what I'm talking about. For me, compression means not letting yourself and everybody else off the hook of what's the conversation that you really need to have.
Yeah. I mean, I was working on things leading up to COVID that, had COVID not happened, I don't think it's an exaggeration, it would have took 6, 7, 8 years to get these things done, and they were done in 6 months. Take the ventilators, right? There were people making ventilators out of things that were never meant to be made. Were never made to be making ventilators out of. And the way people go about solving problems, you just look at it and you think, God, I wonder. I mean, it's hard to maintain, isn't it? But how can we end up just falling back into? It's almost like that didn't happen. It's weird.
Yeah. I don't. Somebody reviewed the book recently. They liked it, but they did say that they found it slightly nihilistic at points. And I kind of understand why they said that, because you could read it a certain way and kind of go, I'm kind of saying this is what human beings do, and we kind of got to make the best of it. And that's not quite what I'm saying. What I'm doubling down on is I'm saying, this is kind of what we're like. So let's be really clear about what the work is.
Yeah.
Be really clear and not pretend that the primary game in town remains how we deal with social processes and relationships until we are all replaced with AI, at which point, clock off. But we're not there yet. And all AI is doing is speeding up the point at which the human beings get together in the room and have to have the conversation where they're going to have the same mess to deal with. So I think the nature of the work remains remarkably similar in some key respects as to what it was 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, etc. years ago.
Yeah, we'll come on to the AI bit in a minute, because I listening to another episode of a very good podcast about some of this stuff today, and like how the human messiness of situations is probably going to be the thing that slows it down. And just like on the podcast, I didn't even realize, but when Edison created, they started creating electricity, it was 60 years after that before most people in America had electricity in their houses. Same with a telephone, right? So you think, oh God, this technology, and then this guy was speaking. I actually read his paper earlier on today. And he's just talking about the human messiness of just how we are is actually, it fights back against the capability. So it may be it may be like, blimey, AI is crazy. But then when most people speak about AI, they talk about large language models, and that all gets a bit, confusing. But it's the messiness of the humans' connections and the interactions that actually slow a lot of this capability down.
But it's also, and this is why I find some of the stuff that came out of the research that people like Dan Ariely have done, and Dan Gardner's book from the early noughties on risk, which I do reference in my book. And it's worth just tipping our hat to that, because what Dan Gardner talks about, he's talking about risk perception and how risk is discussed and framed in politics and the media. And he points out, this is post 9/11 and stuff like that, human beings are really poor at risk assessment and perception. But really, we can't think beyond a 3-year window, and we are still preoccupied with individual cases rather than data. And the most high profile example of that he uses is everybody's move off planes onto the roads post 9/11, because way more people died as a result of that than had they carried on flying. Because even with 9/11, the chances of falling out the sky in a plane were still a lot smaller than cars. He also made the point, I think, if I remember correctly, that if we were to go on what the data shows, we'd be investing more money in asteroid collision prevention than we would in some of the other things we're spending money on, the frame as risks. So this idea that we are wonderfully rational is frankly absurd.
Yeah, there's a fantastic book I read. It's got to be 5 years ago, I think. It's called The Precipice by Toby Ord, and it's all about this. It's about the realities of existential risk and how we get it so badly wrong. And I think it was actually before COVID or just after COVID I read it, because he was going on, one of the chapters is about lab leaks. It happens way more than people realize. And he went into as well about like the accidents that have actually happened in nuclear bunkers. It's crazy. And how this stuff is running on 19s technology. It's just still working on floppy disks.
Well, so my one bit of work with with BAE Systems a few years ago, I remember somebody there telling me that, of course, when they first were designed Trident submarines, they were all spec'd on Windows 95. And in whatever it was, 2016, whenever I was there, it was, they were on XP or whatever was around, and they were still having to work out how to then redesign and reconfigure everything for the next generation. That to me is a lovely example of how things are closer to. I talk a lot in the talks I do about how Wile E. Coyote from the Warner Brothers cartoons is the patron saint of silver bullets. I think the Acme Corporation are actually far more active in life than we realise.
Best case scenario, you go in with an organization, you sit them down, and there's no conversation about like methodologies and frameworks. How does that conversation form? That's the starting point for a lot of people.
Well, it's interesting. I don't tend to get involved in conversations like that. I tend to come at a level of practice development for the change practitioners or team development of executive teams and stuff. One of the things I notice is how disconnected conversations are about capability building, practice development for senior leadership teams and for change teams. They tend to be regarded as disconnected interventions, which I find fascinating. So I don't tend to find myself in those conversations about methodology. So I do, what I do come up against is the impact of those decisions. So I can think of clients where I've worked where there is, for example, the assumptions about change at a senior level are utterly dominated by the idea that governance models, tools, and process trump everything else.
Yeah.
That there is no need to pay any attention to emotions or transition. And funnily enough, that doesn't go that well. But there's some uncomfortable stuff, which is in one sense utterly blindingly obvious, but I don't hear talked about that much what it should usefully be, which is often senior leaders who are advocating for the next round of change and are passionate and determined that things are different are also that team will be made up of a large number of people who are responsible for the current status quo. So you're then in this interesting, the honest conversation would be, how is what we currently have now a reflection of who we are now? If we are going to change it, how do we need to change?
Yeah.
Because otherwise what we're saying is we got it wrong in part, or something needs to change. You want you all to change, but we're saying we're not going to. Now that is a kind of an oversimplification in one sense, but I've seen it too many times where I've heard stories from clients where you hear the disconnect between the rhetoric at a senior level of this needs to change, but a lack of awareness about what that means for those very people themselves.
Yeah, I think that definitely goes on. It's like we have to change, but when we say we have to change, we mean like, you lot have to change, not us. If you're the person that's being told you have to change, the reality is that the people further up aren't going to change. Well, the friction that causes is massive.
So I've noticed in recent years, and I've checked this out with other consultants to see whether or not it's just my experience in my client base or whether this is a wider pattern. And I've had several people say to me, no, we see that too. In executive teams and leadership teams, there's one thing you'd expect them often to be really good at. It's really basic, right? It's, do they keep track of what they've agreed? Do they end a meeting knowing what actions have been agreed? Do they end the meeting knowing who's owning them and what they're going to do and by when? But here's the kicker. Do they then come back at a later date and hold each other to account?
Yeah.
And it's surprising how often that muscle is not worked. The practices, because there's practices in that. That's why I talk about practice. The practices of effective, capturing of actions and running meetings, then the relational practices of holding to account and constructive conflict and dialogue, those muscles are not worked well enough.
Yeah.
If leadership teams in particular are not really focusing on those, then is it any surprise that all this other stuff then starts to fray around the boundaries of those conversations?
Yeah, and there's some really simple things I think people can do there. We used to call it like after action review, or even before the situation, you do a bit of red teaming. Go and look on liberating structures and things like that. These things are simple to do.
They are, but what we have to remember is that all of those things are containers for anxiety. Liberating structures are brilliant, I agree with you, but they are actually containers for anxiety. And to engage with them, you then need to engage with whatever anxiety or stress or storm at play. And so long as we collude with each other, these conversations can all be had at a purely rational level, and that we don't need to talk about power, or we don't need to talk about our fear or whatever. Then we're going to be deluding ourselves. I sat just, and to make this point, I sat in a room with 30 people from a global organization. I was asked to be there in the autumn because I don't know them. So they wanted my perspective with a colleague who knew them very well. And I was asked my observations about 2/3 of the way through day one. And I said to them, they were talking about, plans to do with AI and changes to legislation. And these are all people, I will guarantee you, every single person in that room earned £1 million or more.
Yeah.
Right? And I said to them, it's been fascinating listening to you. And everything you've talked about so far today is to do with change. You've not used that word once. Okay. So this is the problem. Is that you have an organization, a global organization, that is talking about change with everything that entails, but not using that word and not actually embracing what that means. Credit to them. 2 or 3 of them did say to me, in the coffee breaks or sotto voice on the side, yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Not in the main meeting.
Yeah. Well, I've even heard people saying, don't use the word change, as if it's become almost like a toxic word. Everyone knows there's change going on, but don't say the word change, because that gets people annoyed. This is a weirdo dance going on here.
But see, that's one of the huge myths, which is people don't, it's not that they don't want the word change used, because most people, they may not like it, but the thing that will really hack them off, that will infuriate them, is if you don't talk to them and you don't sit down and break bread with them. And I'm having this conversation with a client at the moment, and me and my colleague have said to them, you need to sit down and break bread with your people and talk about this stuff that we've revealed to you. If you don't, all you're going to do is amplify what it is that is already happening here, and it's not good.
Oh, yeah, I mean, straight away, what's the things that spread within organisations the fastest is rumours. I mean, they'll outpace any sort of corporate comms thing you got going on.
There's something that I had brought home to me in the last week, which I think is really quite fundamental. So a few years ago, and this is in the public domain, there was a team working at Yorkshire Building Society about 10 years ago. They won an award for this, training award, something like that. And the intervention was really simple. They did some social network analysis of the organisation. They've mapped out who were the 50 most well-connected people. Didn't care position, just connections. And this was around culture and behaviour. So you've got these 50 people together in a room, and their opening gambit, Mick, was this. They said, so relative to all this culture stuff, what do we need to talk about? And I shared this story with somebody I'm in a learning set with who works in an organisation to do with childcare. And I didn't know she was going to do this because they're having real concern, because there's always when we're working with youngsters, there's safeguarding issues. And they're being quite parental because it's an organisation that deals with parents and kids. So guess what? Parental leadership. And she said she went into this meeting with the kind of the care workers and the people who are more junior. And she said she was going to go in and basically kind of do a top down, these are the things I think you should be focusing on. And as a result of our conversation, she said she went in and she said, so what is it you think we should be focusing on? And she said it was phenomenal.
Yeah.
They started talking about all the things and she could see this was the important stuff. Funny that what happens when you don't go with your anxiety and you actually move to inquiry. There's a need to be really clear about what assumptions you have about the nature of change. And in an organisational context, that means, because they're the people who have the most power, the most senior people need to be really honest with themselves and with their organisation about what the assumptions are. If the assumptions are that change happens through command and control, then you're screwed anyway. Either short-term or long-term would be my view. I mean, you may get stuff happen, but I don't think it'll be as effective or as creative or as innovative as if you take a more democratic approach. The second thing is, even if you do have an understanding that you're better off involving as many people as possible, you then have to ask the question, do the people involved have the practices to have those conversations? Do enough people know how to do dialogue? Do enough people understand how to do conflict well? Do you have enough people who are skilled at scaffolding the spaces for collective sense making? That's the second part. The third part is arguably the most important, which is, as an organisation, are you genuinely going to give people protection and permission to have those conversations? Genuinely going to give them protection and permission. Because if you're not, then again, you're just doing command and control, hierarchical stuff, coercive stuff by any other name. So the whole protection and permission thing is, it comes from transactional analysis, organisational TA. The idea being that protection sets the conditions for the space which we're operating in, which is, we're going to talk about changing this part of the business, how we deliver these services to our clients and customers or our patients. You've got protection to talk about all of that. But, we're not going to talk about marketing because that's somebody else. But this, fair game. Permission is, yes, you've got total permission to talk about how you do that and you're part of the job and all this stuff. And then the power, the argument goes, comes from actually talking about the stuff that would otherwise remain undiscussable and taboo. Yeah. That's where energy comes from. Unless you can create the space for that, then you're going to end up with stuff just being hidden. And the same, in Waggle terms, the same dysfunctions will be being signalled and perpetuated.
Yeah. I mean, I've got one more question to ask you, but before I do that, Steve, where can people find all your work? I mean, I'll put links to all this on the podcast episode.
The business, which is currently going through a slight morphage, because I'm about to change the positioning slightly, is at edgeandstretch.com. My own kind of personal website, which is where the book lives and where I put things like all the podcasts that I've done, like with lovely people like yourself, is at Hearsum.com. And then I can be found wibbling into the ether on LinkedIn That's why I tend to do my wiggling. So those are the three main places you can find me.
So the last question is the same question I ask every guest, and it's from your perspective, what is the signal we're failing to see?
Can I have two?
You can have two if you want.
So, because they're connected in a way. I think this is these are both particularly important in the current times we find ourselves, where there is ever more righteousness and self-righteousness and ever more position taking, which then is manifesting in organizations. So I would argue that the signals we need to really pay attention to are those that point to our own individual and or collective absurdity. Unless you can genuinely see your own absurdity, then, well, for a start, you're missing out on some shits and giggles, because it's quite funny when you see what a muppet you're being. I've come off calls with people in my office here. My wife, who shares an office with me, sometimes I come off and she's just crying with laughter, saying, "God, you talk such bollocks. How on earth do people pay you for that stuff?" And bless her, but it keeps me grounded, right? Unless you can see your own absurdity from a human point of view, but from an existentialist point of view, you're not actually seeing reality, would be my view. But the second thing connected to this is I increasingly hold an intentional position of cultivating my ambivalence. There's a really good BBC Radio 4 program from about 4 or 5 years ago, which I think you can still get. It's only a half-hour episode. And this guy talks about how we've lost our ability, but also we've lost the collective permission for people to be ambivalent about things. You either have to be for something or against something. Well, actually, I'm not for or against everything.
Yeah.
I'm quite ambivalent about some stuff.
Why does everyone have to have an opinion on it?
I mean, I've got an opinion on everything, Mick. I'm really keen. I'm very opinionated. Really ambivalent as to whether I'm right. I'm okay with you telling me I'm talking bollocks.
Yeah.
But there's some things, I'm very ambivalent about oysters, for example. I'm really not sure. People say that they're great, but I'm very ambivalent about oysters. Not keen on them.
It's really there's going to be a podcast that comes out just before yours.
Yeah.
I won't give what his final signal is, but it's a very similar thing to what you've just said there.
I saw somebody who's very active on LinkedIn at the moment and campaigns very energetically against some of the excesses of DEI, which I have some kind of sympathy for. And again, you can hear my ambivalence. I can see both arguments. But one thing of the framing they use, I thought was really fascinating. In a very respectful challenge they made to somebody who was posting something about gender or something, they used the phrase, "So which side are you taking?" And I thought that framing was really interesting.
I'm glad I don't work in HR. Let's just say that.
Say that. I mean, again, my compassion towards HR has gone up over the years, and one of the biggest myths when I see people lambasting HR is, of course, you get the version of HR that the organisation, in particular the executive, is prepared to give the room. They are a reflection of senior leadership.
Yes, that is a very good point. Well, Steve, I just want to say a massive thank you for your time. Everyone, please go out, buy Steve's book. It's absolutely fantastic.
Right, I've only got one 1-star review. I could do with at least one more. So,
yeah, go and look him up on LinkedIn and follow him. And I just want to say massive thanks for coming on and
have him. I'm glad to come to Waggle Room. As soon as you told me what the Waggle Room was about, I was all in.
Perfect. Well, hopefully we'll meet up face to face at some point. Cheers, Steve.